Hello and welcome to another edition of Dr. K's Psychobabble. Today we're going to be talking about biopsychology, an entire field within the world of psychology, and probably one of the most research-rich going on right now. There's lots of work going on in brain imaging and new technologies to understand the working brain and how it relates to behavior. But what I want to introduce here is sort of an introduction to the field itself and sort of the perspective from a person who's looking at the field of psychology from a broad perspective, is where does biopsychology fit in? So let's take a look at some of the perspectives that lie within the field. And first and foremost, the world of biopsychology is a discipline, and that discipline is represented by its narrowing of its focus, looking at particular causal factors associated with human behavior. In this case, looking at biological factors. So physiological changes in our brain, biochemistry, neurology, the way chemicals interact in our brain, how we process food for energy, how that energy manifests in our body, how different parts of our brain work together. The physiology is a major focal point in the area of biopsychology. Another area is developmental. This is going to link, they're all going to link to some of the topics I'm going to be talking about later, but this is sort of like that genetic timetable about how things change over time, both as a result of the genetic plan, the script that is written into our genetic code, and how that plays out over time as genes are realized and they become expressed, and then others are suppressed, and even then taking into consideration some of the environmental factors that can then impact those particular expressions of our genetic code. So the developmental perspective, looking at how things change, when we look at how memory changes, then the biopsychological point of view on that, well, how does the physiology of memory change? How does the biochemistry of memory change that results in the behavioral changes that we see in reality as people age? And finally, we look at the evolutionary perspective. Now, this is the perspective that says that our complexity arose from a degree of relative simplicity in the history of human beings on Earth, that we were relatively simple organisms and over time became increasingly more complex. And the complexities of our behavior can be broken down in a way and understood as being evolutionary necessary, that those characteristics became prominent in our species because they enhanced our ability to survive. So we could take the complex behaviors of today and look back and see what they meant in that survival time. Now, it's also a worldview. Individuals that come to biopsychology are being exposed to a world understanding that's based solely within the shutters of that particular field. Again, it's that discipline. I personally don't put all my eggs in that particular basket, but the world is a better place, and we understand the human behavior better because people do put a lot of energy trying to explain everything that they come across from this particular standpoint, this worldview. And so we gain from that. Even I'm not a biopsychologist, but I find part of the explanations that they give for human behavior just that much more enriching to my understanding of human behavior. Now, three of the areas that a person would be introduced to if they took an introductory biopsychology class is, first and foremost, the mind-brain connection. And this is really sort of the Achilles heel or the focus point of biopsychology, is trying to bridge that gap between what we make in terms of observations of human behavior and its physiological correlates inside of the brain and the body. simple things simple things to us, like just remembering something or recognizing a fragrance or desiring a pizza and feeling that, I can almost taste the pepperoni kind of thing. Those things, very difficult, basic emotional and sensory experiences, very difficult to kind of locate in the brain. And there's still that gap of knowledge between our understanding of the biology of the brain, which is incredibly rich, and the actual experience of cognition or alertness, remembering something, learning something new, those kind of things. There's still a huge gap. Big areas of research here to be able to try and bridge that gap. And people with that focal point can really say, I'm going to get there and I'm going to find this physiological, biological, biochemical connection and this explanation for what we experience. Of course, the other one is nature and nurture. We often see that as nature versus nurture, but let's just stop with the complexity of them being opposed to one another. It's always both, that there's this unveiling of the human genetic code and there's this environmental factor that comes in and helps set the pace, set the boundaries and whatnot. This interaction between the internal world and the external world. And then finally, because of the history of biopsychology, one of the oldest parts of the history of psychology, that we are kind of on the forefront of ethics in terms of how we conduct research. We're really talking about biology here. So to examine the living brain, we have to be careful about how we do research like that. In the past, we used to look at cadavers. We used to examine people's behavior, then look at their brain after. A famous instance of that is, of course, Einstein, whose brain was sliced up and distributed to all kinds of different places to examine. There's something special about this brain, and they really didn't notice anything. It wasn't until much later when somebody found, in storage somewhere, a piece of Einstein's brain and examined it and found that he had an excess of glial cells, like the supporting structural feeding part of the brain, not the neurons themselves, but the actual ones that sort of support the neurons, that he had way more glial cells and glial structures than did normal people. So that gave us a clue that maybe that was part of the reason why we saw the behavior that he was able to, the imagination that he had. Now, the other way is to look at animals. And here we see, of course, those ethics about how we work with animals. There's certainly a past within psychology and still some presence where we put electrodes into animals' brains, we stimulate, we destroy parts of the brain, and we look at their behavior to understand the structures in the brain and whatnot. So as you can probably tell, ethics and bioethics and research ethics is sort of right on the forefront when we talk about biopsychology. Now, other areas that we look at within biopsychology, there's four of them, four major models, let's say. And this is somewhat repetitive because, like I said, the themes sort of repeat, but this is sort of like the four biggies when you're thinking about biopsychology. And the first one is pursuing the physiological explanation. Now, the physiological explanation is I see a behavior and I can correlate that with neurological activity, brain structures, biochemistry, biology. There's something about happening in the body that produces what I'm looking at when I'm looking at someone behave. Now, of course, one of the major areas of this is in our nervous system, understanding the process of communication within our nervous system, how biochemicals called neurotransmitters interact with each other and interact to have cells pass on the information within the neurological system. We may notice, for instance, that a particular part of the brain is in deficit of a particular kind of neurotransmitter, and therefore we correlate that with a particular behavior that we see. So we're looking for those causal factors, biological causal factors. The whole world of psychotropic medications is to manipulate that in some way. We think somebody is hearing voices that are commanding them to do things. We provide them with a medication that reduces the presence of a pesky neurotransmitter, and those symptoms go down. So we can see that connection between physiological things that are happening in the brain and outward expressions of behavior. Now, the next one is ontogenetic explanations. Had to get that word right. Ontogenetic explanations are pretty much the interaction between our outflowing, unwinding, revealing, lifespan expression of our genetic code and the environmental factors that come in and modify that. Now, as my graphic shows, it's this sort of presentation of our genetic code. The possibly a good example of that would be the current exploration for a genetic causal factor for mental illness, for substance abuse. Is there something in my genes? Did I get, and say in substance abuse, we talk about the silver bullet. Did I get the silver bullet, meaning I have the predisposition to become addicted to substances? It's passed on through my family. Is it somewhere in my code that if I interact with substances, I am more likely to get addicted than other people? And that's that sort of experience of one person can do drugs and drink and whatnot. It doesn't seem to be a problem. Another person comes along and it can wreck their lives. So we are looking, in biopsychology, we're looking for those genetic markers that say this is the difference. This is the notion that this person will become an addict rather than this person becoming an addict, that predisposition. So we're looking for those things within the genetic code, and that'd be one way of focusing research within biopsychology. Now, the next area is, again, this sort of repeated explanations is the evolutionary explanation. And just to drive that in a little bit here, what we have is the notion that we could take something very complex and very social, let's say a dance, and we would say, well, why do we have dance? Why do people like dances? Why is dancing part of every culture? What does that happen? What is the evolutionary reason for that to exist? Looking at, putting those foci on biological explanations, evolutionary explanations. What's the evolutionary explanation for this? And we go back, and maybe it has its origins in our animal mating ritual dances that we did, where we release pheromones and we're running around looking like we're the most powerful being on the field to attract the female to us. And maybe that's changed over the time as our societies become more complex, and that mating rituals are incredibly complex now, and therefore we need an equally complex ritual like that, where now we need lights and music and all of those things to attract our potential partners. Now, the final area that we look at is functional, and this is related to the genetic and evolutionary point of view, but it can be very non-history related. Now, functional, we look at, does this particular trait give a person an advantage? Is it good for their physiological body, for survival? Is this a good trait to have? So in individuals, expressions of emotion, let's say. Now, we know over the years let's assume that's evolved over time, but we look at it right now. What is the advantage of having emotions like fear, sadness, and whatnot? And sometimes when people are experiencing those, they might wish they didn't. It's so powerful and sometimes so painful. But yet, there's a purpose, there's a function that they serve That's biology. That's related to biology. So if I'm fearful of something, my body tenses up, fight or flight, neurological processes start to happen, start to salivate, my heart is pumping, I'm ready to go, I'm ready to fight off any offense. And that is a kind of a carryover evolutionarily from my ability to fight off potential hazards. In fact, we could look at maybe how that backfires a little bit. When you think about a person who has PTSD, the physiological response that they had during the traumatic event was appropriate, meaning they're tensing up, whatever it is that they went through, the emotional experience was appropriate for that moment. The problem is it now happens at times when it's not appropriate and it becomes problematic. When I'm walking along the street and I have a post-traumatic incident and I feel all those things, it's not in line with what's going on around me. So you can see how that sort of damage to that system can create problems. But those systems are there to protect us. Those emotional responses are there to protect our physical being, our mental being. And biopsychologists look for that connection as well. So that's a really brief introduction to the world of biopsychology. I'm certain I'll have lots more little videos about different aspects of biopsychology. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and be sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time.